Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Today, as the prospect of Donald Trump winning or losing the presidency splits the Republican Party, we dig for the roots of the fracture and consider the consequences. To begin, for Hillary Clinton, another unlucky derby. Yes, time for the horse race. She lost the Indiana primary last week, and on Tuesday, Hillary Clinton lost the West Virginia primary to Bernie Sanders. But this only gives Bernie a handful more pledged delegates. It does not significantly increase his chances of winning the nomination. Many primaries to go, but Hillary needs fewer than 150 more delegates to get to the magic number of 2383. But the losses are a blow to her momentum and a reminder of her problem gaining the votes of white men. 8 years ago, Hillary won the West Virginia primary by a whopping 60 points. But of course, that was against a guy named Barack Obama. Sanders' persistence does continue to draw Clinton leftward. She has now come out in favor of an expansion of Medicare for people as young as 50. In contrast to Sanders' Medicare for All proposal, he calls this Medicare for Some. On to the Trump scorecard, which tells us who is hopping aboard the Trump train and who is refusing. Among the no Trumps are two former presidents, George Bush, 41 and 43, Mitt Romney, who had tried hard to derail Trump before the primaries, and former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. Also anti-Trump is Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse, a third-party hopeful and rising GOP star, and rivals for the nomination Jeb Bush and Lindsey Graham continue to be Trump critics, plus Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker. But these outspoken Trump critics are more the exception than the rule. Senators up for re-election in the fall are trying a softer approach in many cases by expressing party loyalty while distancing themselves from the actual candidate. Among those who say they support the GOP nominee but carefully avoid uttering the name Donald J. Trump are swing state senators Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, Rob Portman from Ohio, and Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, along with others facing tight Senate races like Tim Scott in South Carolina, Pat Roberts in Kansas, and Pat Johnson of Wisconsin, all of whom, or I should say Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, all of whom say they support, quote, the nominee. And John McCain, whose fate might rest with Arizona Hispanics. He's also playing it cautiously, highlighting his party loyalty. It is a difficult line to walk, especially when it's not clear where Trump stands.
I have to stay true to my principles also. And I'm a conservative, but don't forget, this is called the Republican Party. It's not called the Conservative Party. You know, there are conservative parties. It's called the Republican Party. I am a conservative.
And how does Trump fare with conservative commentators? Longtime Republican thinker George Will, former Cruz backer Glenn Beck, and Red State editor Eric Erickson are still outspokenly anti-Trump, as are Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol, New York Times conservative columnist Ross Douthat, and Washington Post and commentator Charles Krauthammer. And some big Republican donors are also holding back. Billionaires Charles and David Koch have yet to get behind Trump. And billionaire Paul Singer, the Marco Rubio backer, isn't going to support Trump either. We hear Karl Rove's American Crossroads Super PAC is also sitting it out for now, saying that it will be focusing on preserving Republican Senate seats. So, is the deep split in the GOP temporary or an historic rupture? If Trump loses, might he take the GOP-controlled Senate down with him? And what have we learned about the failures of both parties in a year when a billionaire developer and a Democratic socialist have become so popular? Joining us via Skype from Massachusetts, journalist, Yale political science lecturer, and smasher of liberal orthodoxies, Jim Sleeper. Jim is author of books including Liberal Racism. From Washington, D.C. via Skype, Longtime congressional observer Norman Ornstein, resident scholar at the usually conservative American Enterprise Institute. Norm is co-author of It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. And with us here in our studio, Fordham University political scientist Christina Greer, author of Black Ethnics, Immigration and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
And this is, for the sake of our listeners, not going to be a Trump good or bad debate. You all generally think Trump is a threat to the Republic in one way or another. Mostly we're going to talk about how we got here, and I know you all have different thoughts on that. But let's just establish why you each think Trump is a threat. What is threatening, in your view, about a Donald Trump potential presidency? Christina, you want to start?
Well, I mean, he's already exposed a realistic underbelly of America that many people of color have known has existed since the formation of this nation, but he's really made it a safe space for them to say and now do certain things. I think also internationally, so many countries around the world are now looking at us and wondering what exactly is going on that a person like Trump could actually get this type of momentum. Also, this is someone who, essentially uses a third grade vocabulary to discuss really complex issues. So when we're thinking about our relationships with China and Russia and North Korea, we can't use adjectives like great and huge. We really need someone who understands policy, and I think that's my last point, where I'm really concerned about who he would have in the cabinet, who he would think would be a legitimate Supreme Court nominee, really important long-term conversations. I don't think I trust the people in the room to actually advise him either, especially when you look at some of the people who've endorsed him. Is Sarah Palin the type of person that we actually want as an advisor to the president?
Thank you. Jim Sleeper, what would you add?
Well, I certainly agree with Christina that he's exposed a side of America that blacks have known for a long time. It turns out, though, that a lot of white ethnics have been knowing it for more than a decade as well, and he's finally bringing that to the surface. I would say also that he's exposing not only the bankruptcy of the Reaganite philosophy that has really held so much sway, but also of a kind of democratic neoliberalism. And that, of course, is Hillary Clinton's vulnerability, that kind of Clintonite triangulation. You don't have to be very radical Brian, to say that the problem we're facing is pretty deeply systemic, that both sides have been harnessed to certain assumptions about economic growth that are pretty much unsustainable and destructive.
We're going to get to that in some detail when we look at how we got here. How about the actual threat from a President Donald Trump in terms of what would it do to the country or what would it do to the world that keeps you up at night?
Well, what keeps me up at night is an almost certitude that if he gets his hands on political power, he will become a tyrant. And that has a specific definition, of course. It means abrogating other constitutional protections, checks and balances. Historically, it means having a Praetorian Guard, the kind of goons, the kind of forceful people around you who do bad things to people who disagree with you. There's nothing about him that suggests he would not become like that if he had power.
All right, I gather we're having Skype problems with Norm Ornstein in D.C. Oh, now we've got Norm. So Norm, if you've been hearing this, you've heard some of what Christina Greer and Jim Sleeper said. Their biggest concerns are about a potential Trump presidency. What are some of yours?
Well, I would add a few things to that, Brian. Put aside the racially charged rhetoric and the divisiveness. This is at once and the same time the most insecure and most ego-driven politician I've ever seen. And I think the more he wins, the more that ego gets fed, the more he believes he is omnipotent. And he is also the most ignorant when it comes to public policy of any presidential candidate I've seen over 5 decades, and that includes Pat Paulson, the comedian. So you put those two things together and think about the first year if he's in the presidency. The willingness to do dramatic things without having any idea or concern about consequences, the likelihood that he'll be challenged abroad, as, for example, George W. Bush was when China seized our plane and our crew. He would probably march headlong into confrontation and disaster. The things that we would have to pick up off the ground in terms of relations with other countries, the possibility of a global trade war that could lead to a global depression. There are many, many things that suggest that somebody who knows nothing about policy but believes that he is an omnipotent power would get us into. And even if he learned over a period of time, the cost would be immense.
I wonder if any of you, again, before we go on to how we got here, would acknowledge any opportunities, despite all those threats that you all just enumerated, from a Donald Trump presidency, whether it's the leaving behind, from you all points of view, your points of view, some of the Republican or conservative orthodoxies, social conservative or reflexively small government orthodoxies, or any other potential opportunity that you see if Donald Trump is elected president. Christina, anything?
I think for LGBT rights, and I can't remember which primary he won, but that night he came out and said, I don't think Planned Parenthood's a bad idea. He's like, what's the problem?
He's against federal funding for abortion.
Right, but so I think that this is the beauty and the curse of Donald Trump, is that we actually have no idea. He has no morals, no principles. Like, he's trying to catch a wave upon the sand, right? And so when he says, I don't think that the transgender bathroom bill in North Carolina is a good thing, like, that seems a little ridiculous to me. So many Democrats agree with him. This is what makes him such a threat to many conservative Republicans. But this is also what makes me a little bit nervous, because there are some Republicans who would say, well, see, he's not horrible. He says he misspeaks sometimes, but deep down, I think that he's more middle of the road than he seems, and that's for those kind of possibly weak-leaning Republicans that don't really see what many of us see in him.
Jim Sleeper, anything?
Yes, I would say that what service he has performed along those lines of opening things up, he's performed well enough, thank you very much, as a candidate. And that without power, he has managed to upset and derange a lot of conservative ideology, Reaganite assumptions. He's done that. But again, I think if he had his hands on the levers of power, it would be disastrous.
Anything else, Norm? Trade, anything?
There are reasons why very strongly conservative figures in the Republican Party, whether it's a Ben Sasse or even a Ted Cruz, are uneasy about Trump. And it is because he's not as consistent in his ideology. And I think it's clear from our own discussion that he really doesn't have much of an ideology. And maybe at some point that would mean that he would look at some problems relatively pragmatically to solve in a way that he might have done in the past as a business person. So we can cling to and hope for some things that would make it a little bit better. I think he would be better in some respects than a committed ideologue, but they pale in comparison to the downside.
Norm, I know your book is about the going off the rails into extremism of the Republican Party over the last generation or so. How much do you think the things you document in your book got us to this point as a country where Donald Trump could become even as popular as he is?
There's a lot that's there. And, Brian, I wrote a piece back in August in the Atlantic called Why This Time Might Be Different, suggesting that history wasn't going to be a guide to this particular election. And it was because I was informed very much by what had happened, in this case, to the Republican Party over not just the last few years, but a longer period of time. And if you put that together, a party that my colleague Tom Mann and I said was an insurgent outlier, with the angry populism arising as a consequence of the economic downturn. On the left, with the Occupy movement, but even more with the Tea Party movement on the right, put that together with the rise of tribal media and the kind of apocalyptic vision that is pounded away at day after day, that the country is on the verge of collapse and destruction. And with the reality that we write about very much, that the establishment of the party, including congressional leaders, basically exploited the anger out there and hoped that they could then co-opt the people they brought into power, and many of those angry populists but found that the opposite had happened. And what we got was 60 to 70% support even a year ago in every poll of Republicans for outsider and insurgent candidates, 20% for establishment figures. And as I looked at it, Trump and Cruz were the two who had the opportunity to seize those reins, with Trump being the strongest.
With respect to the Republican Party, Christina, how much is racism, in your opinion, the white elephant in the room, if you will?
Right.
You know, I think there's a narrative of the party having sort of pandered to the sentiments of the white, racially disaffected, let's say, without trying to really give them the reins of the party.
Right, but you can't have it both ways, right? And so we saw this with John McCain when Donald Trump started this, and he's the one who primarily started this language, and John McCain would sort of wink and smile and not really say much.
Wait, John McCain started this language?
No, when Donald Trump started this, when Barack Obama was running against John McCain in 2008, right? And so this was the start of this conversation. Donald Trump was there, sort of talking about the birther movement. You know, even in 2008, he really went hard in 2010, but in 2008, and John McCain sort of winked and smiled and didn't really say much about it, to really nip it in the bud, to say this is actually not what our party is about. Here are actually our other issues. We see that the Republican Party has gone really hardcore with older white men. That's their base, and that's sort of what they're hanging their hat on, and sort of catering to the fears of older white men that the country is going in the wrong direction. It's actually not. It's diversifying in a lot of ways, but older white men are doing pretty well, actually. So
Some are, some aren't.
So some are. But you know, I think there's this narrative that people of color and women are taking things from these white men, and this is something that John McCain did not, squander. And Donald Trump has been able to slowly but surely really prey on, the fears of these and the anger that so many white Americans have had for these past 7 years. I mean, you and I have talked in the past about, data about whites who have black friends, right, or friends of color, and it's 40% say that they do. Then when you ask how many of them are in your employ, they can't be counted as friends. That number drops down to 10%. So we do have a very segregated country. Even New York is segregated in a lot of ways. So the vast majority of the country is still incredibly segregated, and how they think about people of color and immigrants, especially in an economic context, are not favorable relationships. And I think that's what Donald Trump has really been able to get in and expose and exploit.
Jim, what would you add? And then we'll get to the Democrats. But with respect to the Republican leadership, who really did not want this movement, having cultivated it by accident, perhaps.
Well, I agree that the Republicans sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind on race. And they did all the dog whistle stuff and all the innuendos that Christina mentions. I don't think John McCain was actually as bad as Mitt Romney in some ways, but that's a separate discussion. I think the one thing I would add is that since 2008, millions of older white people who may have once have had a $38 an hour job at an auto assembly plant are stocking shelves at Walmart. Their homes are being foreclosed upon. They had those bad loans. And there's a lot of dispossession and a lot of addiction and a lot of despair. And it's easy to cultivate or play upon that, as Trump is doing, even without explicitly appealing to race, as he is also doing. They're in trouble.
How about the Democrats? Jim, you've written whole books about white liberal Democrats' relationship with black activists, mostly in the 80s and 90s. You talked earlier a little bit about Clinton-esque triangulation as having set the stage for this. What are the sins of the Democratic Party that helped set up the success of the Trump movement to date?
Well, I think one of the basic things is that a lot of liberals, well-meaning, have done so well by the system as it is, by the kinds of arrangements that we have, that they really don't want to reconfigure it very seriously. They don't believe in it wholeheartedly, so they resort to certain tokenistic gestures. They find people to adore who are black or others without really addressing the underlying systemic problems that continue to divide blacks from blacks as well as black from whites. If you really want to get at things, and again, as I was saying, I don't think you have to be very radical to say this. Neoliberal Democrats, the Clintons and others, have been as much involved in a system of casino-like financing, predatory lending, intrusive, relentless marketing that is destructive. It's destructive of public virtue. It promotes impulse thinking. Look at what's happened to a lot of the media under the impact of this constant drive for quarterly profits of the max. All of those things, it's not just globalization and technological upheaval, important though they are. It's this kind of attitude, this policy, that Democrats kind of slid into and are as complicit in as the Republicans. Now, the Republican obstructionism has really thrown a wrench into the things that Democrats have tried to do, but they themselves, we ourselves, would have to undergo a major rethink on our side as well, I think.
Norm Ornstein, what would you add? Your book is about how the Republican Party moved into extremist territory. How about failures of the Democratic Party to land us where we are right now?
Well, it's certainly there's plenty of blame to go around. I'm not quite as critical of the Clintons, certainly, as Jim is. And I think, if you read, as I would recommend it, President Obama's commencement address at Howard University this past week, which was in many ways a defense of an approach to governance that's realistic given the obstacles that exist in the American constitutional system, now multiplied dramatically by the obstructionism and the tribalism that exists out there. It gives me more sympathy for them. But I think Jim has a very good point that in the broader system now, the degree to which the parties have been captured by larger economic interests and have not turned their focus much to the gaping and growing inequality that we have out there, or the problem of stagnant wages, or even the problem of people who fulfilled what we would say is the social contract. They go to work, they work 40 hours a week, and in return for that, you're supposed to be able to get an adequate place to live, food to put on the table, the ability to send your children to school and give them a better life. How do you make that contract work? There has to be more focus on that, and both parties, I think, have fallen short. Although you can't cast the blame equally there either.
Christina, what would you add?
I agree with Jim with sort of Democrats need to reckon with their neoliberal policies from the past 25 to 30 years. And the Clinton involvement in that makes this election particularly stressful for a lot of Democrats because in a lot of ways, Bernie does expose so many of the problems that Democrats have had with their own party, with these centrist candidates, where in some ways they look like holograms of Republicans in many ways. This is trickled down to the city level in management where we have Democratic mayors, but they operate in some ways as businessmen and some of the concessions they have made either with their state governments or with their governors. For me as a Democrat, we're looking at a flawed candidate from a flawed system that in some ways she has helped create in some way. She can't really decide, unfortunately, whether she wants to take credit for her role in the 90s or not, which is also, unfortunately, going to be one of the things that Trump is going to be able to expose. You can't have it both ways. Either you were the first lady or you were a co-conspirator in some of these policy decisions. And I think right now, Democrats have been using the title, and we're forced now to think about what that title has meant. And we are a very diverse group, the same way Republicans are diverse, and we're seeing their own civil war. But I do think that Philadelphia will expose just how diverse the group of Democrats are and
the
how
Democratic Convention.
the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, and how difficult it may be for the two teams to come together. This will not look like 2008, where Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in many ways overlapped on a lot of issues, and there were just a few key issues where they disagreed, but they were relatively similar. We're not seeing this in a Hillary Clinton and a Bernie Sanders competition.
David Frum had an article in The Atlantic this week suggesting that Clinton has a chance to unify the country in a way that the last several presidents who were so polarizing in different directions have not succeeded in doing, partly because she's got this credibility or attempt from the old days to move to the right and seem to be acceptable, to center-right people in America, so that if she's elected, well, number one, first, she may be able to build a big enough coalition to get elected, and number two, maybe she can actually do something in office that historically reunifies the country. How much do you think this is true?
I think that's the dream scenario. That even though she's being pulled to the left, she will, if we think of her election as a distribution curve, normally presidents are in the center, including Barack Obama. I always say the only thing radical about Barack Obama is his skin color. He is not a radical president by any stretch. So if Bernie's able to pull her to the left, she will be able to capture sort of her centrist folks and some people who are slightly to the right, as well as some folks to the left. In an ideal scenario, that's the case. If Bernie pulls her too far to the left, where she has to say some things that will come back to haunt her by November 8th, then I think we're in a real danger.
We've only got about a minute and a half left in the show, and I'd like to get the other two of you on the same question. Norm Ornstein?
I actually think the ability to unify the country, given the broader nature of our politics and the tribal element, and what will be a strategic move to delegitimize her presidency as we look towards the next election, especially for a Republican Party falling apart, will make that very difficult. But I would add that, I do think that Democrats face a problem now from a group of people who I view as entirely unrealistic in not understanding what it takes to govern. Those who ripped apart Bill Clinton for his presidency and Barack Obama don't understand the difficulty of getting almost anything done, and it's quite miraculous what both were able to achieve given the obstacles.
The only thing I would say to that is that when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, he was not predicted to do the kinds of things he wound up doing. It was only because there were large organized movements, a rising labor movement, and worse in some cases, that kicked him on his left flank. So Bernie has this difficult thing of trying to balance getting Hillary elected when it comes to that, and yet developing some kind of movement that can keep pushing her when he is no longer a candidate.
And hopefully, from the Democrats' point of view, that will be a line which sounds very difficult as the two of you lay it out for Clinton if she is the nominee to walk. Time will tell on that when we get that far. Well, thank you all for participating in this special Hollywood Squares edition and special edition on the topic of how we got there on the issue of the Donald Trump movement getting this far. Thank you all very much.
Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
And that's POTUS 2016 for this week. We're here every week at this hour, calling the political horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Next time, results from the Oregon and Kentucky primaries, and the Great Divide scorecard continues. Who has jumped onto the Trump train among the Republicans and who refuses? I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.